Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition, our 259th, being recorded on Thursday, June 11th, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we've got Andrew Duthie. I didn't get to pronounce that. Is it Duthie or Duthie? I should have asked.
It's done. Yep, you got it
Duthie.
right the first time.
There you go. Thank you. And he's going to be presenting on low code for the ColdFusion developer. And so with that, I will let you take it away. Thanks again for coming on.
Sounds good. All right, let's see if I can make the magic work.
Bam.
Looks good, I think.
Yep.
Okay. So first off, I want to say thanks to everybody for coming to listen in. My name is G. Andrew Duthie. I like to say it's like Duffy with a lisp. It's an easy way to help people remember. I'm a developer advocate with OutSystems, and OutSystems is a vendor of low-code tools. So just putting that out there right from the beginning, just to be clear. Just want to talk about what, or just give you a brief kind of overview of what we're going to talk about. Not going to go bullet by bullet through this, but this is kind of the general picture of what we're going to talk about. I want you to notice in the middle there, we do have a demo. So we will not be doing just PowerPoint. I'm not a huge fan of PowerPoint, but it's important to kind of give you some background, some understanding of what low code is, why you should care about it. One of the things I want to point out is in the title of the talk, I talked about what is it and why should you care. I'm actually going to flip that script a little bit because I think it's important to let you know why you should care about it before I talk about what it is. Because obviously, if you don't care, what difference does it make what it is? So, a couple of caveats. I want to be really clear that this talk is not going to get down into the nitty-gritty or super deep levels of detail, right? This is not a, teach you everything you need to know about low code in an hour. That's probably not a very realistic thing to do. Also want to say, please do feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go. I will do my best to take a peek at the chat here and again. I will also ask Charlie to keep me honest. If I miss a question that looks like it's important to address, I'm going to ask him to, keep me on top of it in case I happen to miss something. All right. So why you should care about low code. Starting off, low code solves several important problems. One which we'll talk about a little bit more after this slide is the talent gap. So there are loads and loads and loads of companies globally, also in the US, that need developers desperately and cannot hire enough developers. Right? There are major backlogs of applications at most organizations that I've talked to that just aren't being met. Right? The company needs applications for a variety of purposes. IT team really can't keep up. Another problem that low code solves is the idea of cognitive load. So we're all really busy. We're all kind of constantly, taking in tons and tons of information. And the reality is that standard coding, it's just flat out harder. It's more difficult to, it's more difficult for us to take a look at a chunk of code and absorb what that code does and figure out how to solve a problem we may be having with it than it is other problem areas that we might think of. And it's easier, we'll see how this works with low code, to be able to understand and address applications and the application functionality more quickly. I'm sure I'm probably not alone in having written code and come back to it 6 months later and really had almost no idea why I wrote the code that I did, the way that I did, and in some cases, exactly what it's doing. That's just kind of in the nature of what we do when our brains are involved and deep in the context of a particular problem that we're solving with code, right? We've got that, we get in the flow, we write the code. When we come back to it, we don't have that context anymore. And so it's a little harder to kind of rebuild that context and understand what we were doing. on the topic of backlogs, I'm probably not the only person who's had a boss that's something like this, right? I don't want to hear about how overloaded you are. I don't want to hear about how many hours you're working. I need this application yesterday, right? So probably not an uncommon experience. Another thing, particularly for those of you who are freelancers, low code can be a real big moneymaker. So when you listen to the analysts, like I think this was Forrester, Forrester predicts that in the space of about 2 years, the low code market is going to grow from somewhere around $13 billion annually to around $21 billion annually. And as of 2024 or 2025, probably somewhere in the vicinity of $45 billion. That is a huge market, and a market that at that level of growth with companies, and that's basically an estimate of what companies are going to be spending on low code tools. What that means is that there's going to be tremendous demand for people who can actually utilize those low code tools to develop applications for the people spending this money. So just something to keep in mind. Low code can also be fun. Why do I say that? I'm a geek. I am like a geek's geek. I like to build stuff. I like to do fun application implementations. Just as a measure of my geek cred, I don't know if anybody who's on is interested or aware of 3D printing. I'm a 3D printer geek. I have, at this moment, 4 different 3D printers in my house, one of which actually technically belongs to my 13-year-old son, 3 of which I have, and 2 of which I use on a pretty regular basis. So why do I mention 3D printers? Because of this. So the central part of the picture that you're seeing right now is something called a stepper motor. Probably a year and a half ago, my boss sent me in a box a stepper motor and a small plastic shaft. And I wasn't sure exactly what he was wanting me to do with it. He told me, and then I forgot, and then I asked him again. And basically what he wanted was, he wanted me to design something to connect a stepper motor to the paddle wheel of a food dispenser. The food dispenser is kind of what you see in the background with the M&Ms. And the idea was to create an internet-connected candy dispenser. So if you're looking at this picture, the bracket that you see holding up the stepper motor is 3D printed, and it's something that I designed. You can't see the shaft that connects the stepper motor to the paddle wheel because it's inside, but basically this gave me an opportunity to actually use 3D printing to custom design and manufacture parts, and then connect this candy dispenser using a small microcontroller board to an OutSystems low-code application, simply by using REST APIs. So the microcontroller board that I used makes it very simple to create REST APIs, and then I could call into those REST APIs and dispense candy using the stepper motor. I could light up LEDs. If you look at the kind of left side of the stepper motor, I've got a little LED ring and a 3D printed, it's our mascot Neo, a 3D printed cover for the LEDs. So I could do all kinds of fun stuff with an application, and the application was fast and easy for me to build. I've also done applications where I control Bluetooth robots. Another scenario that was kind of fun and allowed me to experiment with low code and devices is I built a temperature and humidity monitor for my refrigerator. My kids left the refrigerator or freezer door open at one point, froze up the coil, everything got warm, and we had to throw out a bunch of food. So I thought, why don't I create something that can see if the light's on, that can keep track of the temperature and humidity, report that back to an OutSystems application, and then from the application, I actually leveraged a connector for Twilio to, when the light was on for longer than, I think it was like, a minute, it would give me a button where I could just call my home number and it would read back a message that said, please close the fridge door. So that was kind of fun. So you can have fun, experiment, you can learn new things and enjoy yourself while you're doing it. Another important reason that you should care is that your organization may choose to adopt low code, and your boss may come to you and say, I need you to learn this and do it, right? I need you to work with this low code tool. But your response might be something like this, but it doesn't have to be scary. I'm going to pause for a second. I'm not seeing questions yet, but please, just a reminder, if you do have questions, you can go ahead and post those in the chat, and I'll be happy to address those questions. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit more about the talent gap. So this is some information from Gartner as of January 2019. And you can see that over time, over the time that the report covers, the talent shortage has really come to the fore as a really important risk for a lot of enterprises. And again, that's because enterprises are becoming more and more reliant on applications, on digital transformation is kind of one of the industry buzzwords, right? So as enterprises are moving more and more of their business to the digital realm, they need more and more developers to bring those apps into fruition. Again, kind of going from Gartner, Gartner says that by 2024, 3/4 of large enterprises will be using at least 4 low-code development tools for IT application development and citizen development initiatives. Also by 2024, low-code app development will be responsible for more than 65% of application development activity. That's according to Gartner. Now, is it possible that Gartner's overestimating? Sure. But as these problems that we talked about, the application backlogs, the talent shortage, as those things continue to be struggles for enterprise organizations, they're increasingly turning to low code as a way of kind of bridging that gap, if you will. So what is low code? Hopefully at this point I've convinced you that it's something you should care about. And again, something you should care about is not necessarily saying, hey, everybody jump ship right now, right? That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm saying is keep an eye out for it, take a look at it, understand it, so you're better prepared for it. So what is low code? So low code originated as an analyst term. I think it was actually Forrester coined the term for platforms that support rapid application development, one-step deployment, and use of high-level programming abstractions. And that term abstraction is going to come into play a lot more as we continue the conversation. So you think about things like model-driven development or metadata-based development. I also include visual development, and we'll see that here shortly. So I like to refer to low-code as kind of a higher-level abstraction of programming, because we have a history in this industry of abstraction from kind of the lowest level at the hardware level, right, up to things that make programming easier to understand for humans and also make humans more productive. Because at the end of the day, our job isn't necessarily writing code so much as it is solving problems. So when we think about the evolution of programming, right, at the beginning, right, is what the hardware understands. Computers understand ones and zeros, right? At the end of the day, what we're talking about is switches. We're turning on and off switches. There's actually a really good book, if you've never read it. Actually, it's a really good book, even if you have read it. There's a book called there's a book from Charles Petzold called Code. And it's actually a description of how computers work and how code works that starts from a couple of kids in neighboring houses communicating with one another with flashlights turning on and off, all the way up to switches, flip-flops, registers, the whole 9 yards. He kind of goes through all of the parts that make it possible for computers to do what they do, and also make it possible for those of us who write programs to do what we do. But it all starts with ones and zeros. Then we moved up to assembly, right? So assembly was an abstraction that made it more efficient and easier to develop code, But ultimately, assembly runs on the hardware as ones and zeros. The next evolution was to languages like C, C++, C#, Java. All of these are languages that, again, aim for greater human readability and greater human understanding and higher productivity. Right? They abstract certain certain parts of the programming process into either language constructs or libraries or utilities to make it easier and faster for us to develop applications, right? So, an example there. Now, the next evolution from those languages to what we refer to as low code, and this is an image, a screenshot from a workflow in the OutSystems integrated development environment, again, takes that abstraction to the next step, right? And takes it to a visual programming metaphor that uses widgets and visual flows instead of lines of code. Now, in this evolution, I would say ColdFusion probably sits somewhere in between these last two blocks. Primarily, again, I think about things like CFML controls and widgets. Right, there's abstraction that goes beyond just the simple matter of lines of code to where you can substitute what would normally be a bunch of different lines of code or procedural language with a simple tag. Right, just one example. All right, so just another way of kind of looking at this, right? At the hardware level, we've got the ones and zeros, we've got assembly and machine language. When we're working with higher level languages like C, C++, C#, Java, etc., right? When we're working with those higher level languages, we don't need to understand how the registers work in the hardware. We don't need to understand the assembly and machine language that the processors run on. Right, those things are abstracted away from us, and I dare say that most of us would count that a good thing, right? That it's not a bad thing that we don't have to get down into assembly. Now, I do remember the days of demos where there was actually a class of programmers who would write music and animation software in assembly. And they did that to kind of prove their prowess in terms of what kind of amazing stuff they could do in a tiny amount of program space. While those things are really quite impressive, and I didn't mind geeking out on them when I was younger, I really didn't have any ambition to be somebody who was programming assembly, right? So I was grateful for the higher level languages that allowed me to learn to be a programmer and to make use of computers for that purpose. And just as a little bit of background, actually, my college degree was actually in music and theater, and I spent about 6 years after college doing technical theater in the Washington D.C. theater market, and then chose to move into IT. And I think in many ways, it's thanks to the work of those who brought these high-level languages to life that I had an easy path to become a software developer, rather than, kind of getting hung up on things that I probably at that point wasn't fully ready to understand. Now, when we think about low code, or sometimes refer to it as visual development, it really just takes that abstraction up a level to where you don't necessarily need to understand or use a high-level language, but you still can use some of those high-level languages in order to extend the platform where the platform doesn't suit your needs, right? So in the case of OutSystems, that includes being able to write components in C# using a .NET language and use those directly in your applications. That also includes being able to use custom HTML and JavaScript and CSS, right? So the ability to customize the platform is part of why it's called low code versus no code, right? But the vast majority of the time, you're spending your time using visual metaphors for development, in it, which gives you kind of a highly efficient way of developing applications. So when we think about this, ultimately that move from binary up to assembly, up to higher level languages and to visual development, the goal is typically faster productivity, easier maintenance, and abstracting that underlying complexity. I hate the term hiding, because the reality is that one of the conversations that people will frequently have when you start talking about abstraction is, well, great, you've abstracted it, but it's a leaky abstraction. Sometimes you have to know about it. Well, that's a fair point, but it doesn't mean that the abstraction doesn't have value, right? And doesn't improve the way that you work with your applications. So just shortly before we get into the demo, I've got a couple more points I want to make. Low code versus no code versus code. So low code is kind of what I'm talking about primarily. No code is a variant. They kind of occupy similar space. No code really refers to a purely drag and drop visual or model based development paradigm, right? And then obviously code, that could be everything from, Windows desktop applications, web services, websites, etc. So in terms of who can do it, low code can kind of span the range from pro developers, business analysts, technical end users. For OutSystems, we really look for people to have at least some technical savvy, simply because they're going to have an easier time building the applications. No-code tools tend to target pretty much anyone, often referring to themselves as citizen developer tools, right? The challenge there really is that in order to reach that goal, oftentimes no-code tools need to have very high guardrails. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I'm not trash talking no-code or anything, but it's a trade-off that you make, right? The trade-off is, okay, in order for me to be able to support this class of people building applications with this product, I have to make certain guiding principles or limitations in what they can do in order to make sure that they can be successful, right? So again, it's just a trade-off. Obviously, when you're dealing with an application in code, whether that's in Visual Studio or ColdFusion or whatever the case might be, that's going to be professional developers. I mean, you're going to have people at all levels of the profession, obviously, but you're not going to have your typical office worker is not going to open up an IDE and start developing in ColdFusion, right? It's less likely that way. In terms of complexity, low code runs from kind of low to moderate complexity, depending on the application. No code tends to be very low complexity. Applications with code tend to be moderate to high, right? So again, kind of a spectrum there. In terms of extensibility, again, the variation is low code kind of sits in the middle on extensibility. Depending on the platform, you might have a set of integrations or libraries that can be used. You may be able to add various types of code. As I mentioned, OutSystems allows you to leverage C# code, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and also REST APIs. But other platforms may offer different types of extensibility. No-code platforms, typically you're going to work with pre-built integrations, widgets, etc. only, right? You're not going to be writing your own custom code typically. And then if you're writing code, obviously you've got whatever that particular code platform gives you access to. Your development environment is typically for low code is typically going to be either an IDE or a web-based tool. No code tools are mostly, I'm not going to say this is 100% the case, but mostly web-based. So you're going to access them via a browser. And for full-on code, usually you're going to be working with an IDE. Last pivot, and these are just some specific pivots that I picked out, right? You can do the analysis and the comparison on a number of other factors. Last one that I picked out was whether you can build an app for the App Store, right? So with low code, that's going to vary. OutSystems, the platform that my company makes, you can actually produce native app packages that you can deploy via the app stores. You can use internal company app stores, etc. No code, again, this is going to vary, but oftentimes the answer for that is no. So oftentimes with no code, one of the trade-offs that you're making is you're going to actually be running web applications. Those web applications can be tailored to a mobile device, but more often than not, they're just web applications. And obviously, if you're writing plain old code, you could write Java for Android. You could write C# with Xamarin. If you were a Microsoft platform person, you could do your own app wrapper for publishing to the store, right? So lots of different choices you've got there. All right, so advantages and disadvantages of low code. So primary advantage of low code is faster time to deployment and also faster time to change. So this is a place where people sometimes get a little confused. They might think about kind of previous similar applications like 4GL and RAD and whatnot, where the visual development paradigm was really just the first time that you did something, right? So you would develop your application using these visual paradigms, you compile your application, and from then on, you're really just maintaining that application as code. With low-code tools, the goal is really that you stay in that visual development paradigm throughout. And so updates to applications, adding features, fixing bugs, can be just as fast as developing the initial application. Reduced cognitive load. So again, I kind of talked about the complexities of dealing with code. I'm not going to go too much into this. We'll kind of see some of this in the demo, and hopefully that'll make this a little clearer. Also open to more stakeholders, right? So even if a low-code tool isn't like a pure citizen developer tool, technically savvy people can contribute to the development of applications using low code, right? Whether that be prototyping an application and then turning it over to the developers for completion, or whether that be actually building simple applications for departmental use or other purposes. What that means is that if those simple use cases can be taken off the plate of the development team, right, they have more time and more bandwidth to do the things that are either more important or more interesting. And by more important, I also mean of more value to the organization. And I will say, as a software developer, I want to be doing the work that is most valuable to the organization, because that's how my value increases. So if there's somebody who can do the simple kind of CRUD applications using a low-code tool, and I can use the tools that I care about to build the really interesting stuff or the really valuable stuff, that's all goodness for me. In terms of disadvantages, one of them is lack of control. Now, I say perceived because, again, the perception when it comes to a visual development tool is I'm giving up the ability to kind of control every little bit of what this code does. I say perceived because this is true of every single abstraction, right? We go back to binary to assembly, we go back to assembly to high-level languages, right? At each one of those steps of abstraction, we're giving up a certain amount of control and allowing the platform or the tools to make some decisions for us. That leads into kind of the next disadvantage, right? Opinionated platforms, right? Opinionated platforms meaning that the platform is making some decisions for you, right? A good example of this with OutSystems is OutSystems has a built-in kind of end-to-end workflow or life cycle, right? So I develop my application, I publish it, I use another tool from OutSystems to move that application from development to test to production, right? All of that is included, which is great if you're good with that. But if you've already got tools and processes that you're kind of wedded to, that can seem like, well, I don't know that I want to give that up. Now, of course, you can plug in other pieces into that life cycle, but some decisions have already been made kind of out of the box, if that makes sense. Now, again, this is one where I see it's really kind of a perception thing. closed or more closed ecosystems. So again, the idea of an abstraction is like some decisions have already been made, and they've been made in that, right, you have a tool that you use, you have a server that's going to host your application. Those decisions have already been made, as opposed to taking a smorgasbord approach of, well, I'm going to do source control with GitHub, or I'm going to do source control with SVN, or I'm going to use Jenkins for orchestrating my publishing, etc. All of those things are certainly possible to leverage as well in many low-code platforms. But again, the kind of the decisions, the default decisions don't necessarily lend themselves to that. I'm just going to pick and choose and kind of I'm going to make a lot of decisions up front and do a lot of software install up front. That's really not a kind of a way to get productive and simple, if that makes sense. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Last but not least, one of the disadvantages or the complaints that I hear is it's not what I do, right? I'm a programmer. I write code. And I hear that a fair amount when I talk about low code. And I get it. But as I kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, I think that it's really important for software developers to recognize that the key about being a software developer isn't writing code. It's solving problems, right? If you are solving problems, and particularly if you are solving what's sometimes referred to as expensive problems, right? Whether you're working as a freelancer for a client or whether you're working as a programmer in an enterprise organization, if you solve expensive problems, you have a great deal of value to that organization or to that client, right? If what the client is paying you to do is write lines of code, then your value is really kind of based on that productivity of it. Well, how many lines of code did you write today? But that doesn't correlate very well to problem solving. So I'll get off my soapbox. That's just kind of my opinion or take on that. All right. So with that said, we'll go ahead and jump in to our demo. Let's see if I can pull up. Now for the moments. All right. Just want to double check and make sure. Yep, looks like you're seeing what you should see. All right, so what you are looking at here on screen is the OutSystems development environment. We call it Service Studio. Now, the way that this works is when I have Service Studio installed on my local machine, I can connect to one or many different environments. And when I'm connected to that environment, I will see all of the applications or components that are available in that environment. So right now, I am connected to my personal demo environment, Duthie Demos Dev, and it's out in our OutSystems Cloud environment. So OutSystems is by default a cloud-based application. I guess you'd call it a platform as a service, application platform as a service. So I have a demo server that I have access to. I actually have a number of different servers that I can connect to. And I can see all of the things that I've been working with in this particular application. So to kind of kick the demo off, I want to start a new project. And when I start a new application, I've got a choice of various types of apps. So I can choose kind of the newest style is the reactive web application. This is responsive in terms of reaching desktop down to mobile. And it's based on React.js under the covers. So we'll just call this ColdFusion Meetup. And one of the things I can do here is grab an image and actually use that image to drive some of the color scheme of my application. So we'll go ahead and create that application. And the application can be thought of as a container. That container can have multiple modules. In this application, we're just going to have one module, which will contain our front end, our logic, all that good stuff. But you can break your application up into multiple modules, which could, you could have a module that represents your data. You could have a module that represents server logic that you want to execute and such. We're just going to keep it simple for this demo. So now that I've created that demo, or that module, you can see I'm kind of got a blank screen here, and the place that things start is this idea of a flow, right? A flow is a container for one or more screens, or what we call blocks, which are UI widgets. And I can start by doing just kind of a basic hello world. But instead of doing just something where I'm going to type hello world on the screen, because you've probably all seen that, I'm going to leverage a template. So I can take one of a series of templates here, and I can build an application screen based on that template. Now this template is actually going to leverage some sample data. So what this allows me to do is quickly build out a UI that is very appealing and a good-looking UI. And then later I can replace the data in this application with data that is more or that is related to the actual use case that my application wants. Now I'm going to go ahead and click this big green button at the top of the screen. This is called one-click publish, and the idea here is when I click that button, what's going to happen is it's going to make sure that all of the code looks good, compile it into the actual web application, any necessary database scripts. If I've made any changes to the underlying database, it will update the model and deploy and publish any data, and then deploy that web application to the application server. In this case, the underlying application server is IIS. So when this changes to that arrow, it's going to indicate to me that, hey, we're ready to go. So I'll go ahead and click open in browser. I just want to make sure that we open in the browser that I want so that we're on the screen. And what you'll see is I'm getting prompted for a login. Now, honestly, I'm not going to worry about logins for this, but I wanted to show you this for a reason, because by default, when I create a new screen, it's going to have the only available role that can see that screen is this registered role. So that basically means if the person has a user account on my server, they can visit this application. I can also say I want this page to be available to anonymous users. That means people who are not logged in. I can also create my own custom roles. We're not going to get into that in this demo. So I've clicked checked the anonymous button. I'm going to republish. Now again, I talked about kind of the speed with which you can fix issues, right? So literally in less than 10 seconds, I just fixed that application, and I can just go back to the root here, and you can see the dashboard, right, that I just created, right? So by default, buttons and such are just tied to an action that's going to pop up a feature not implemented, and you can implement those as you go. Okay, so simple dashboard screen. Let me real quick open up the browser tools and switch this to kind of a mobile view. So if I was looking at an iPad, for example, you can see that the layout of the page reflows for the particular screen size, right? So something like an iPhone, you get a little more stacking. Something like an iPad. I accidentally zoomed with my mouse wheel. So, something like an iPad, you get a little bit more side by side. And if you look for, if we look at, switch back to kind of the desktop view, right? You get, again, a bit wider layout. So by default, everything that you're doing in here is going to be laid out such that it works for responsive design principles. All right. So what do we do next? All right. What if we want to work with data? All right. So one of the things that pretty much most applications need to do is deal with data. So there's a whole tab in Service Studio that's devoted to working with data. And every application or every environment has a built-in platform database. Now, by default, that database is going to sit on top of SQL Server. The platform database also supports the use of Oracle as a platform database. The platform also supports external databases. So you can integrate with an external SQL Server, external data sources from a variety of database vendors. Also, you can integrate with REST. So any NoSQL databases will typically have REST APIs as well. So you've got the ability to work with a variety of different databases. So I can just start adding entities. So I could say, I want a person entity. I can give that person a name. I can give that person an email. Now, one of the things I want you to notice here is that as I added this email attribute to this person entity, it automatically figured out, based on how I named that attribute, that this should be an email data type. Inherent in that is that later on, if I start using this in forms and such, I get built-in validation that this actually is a correctly formatted email, right? And there are a number of different data types. So the platform is pretty helpful in terms of determining based on naming patterns and conventions. So if I said is alive, that would be a silly attribute to have for a person, but notice that because it figured out is alive, it knows that that should probably be a Boolean. And all of these are things that I can override later on, but it just makes it faster to build out a data model quickly. The other thing to notice is that I have a series of CRUD operations that are automatically a part of any entity in the platform database. So this allows me to very quickly get up and running and have the ability to add records, to delete records, to modify records very simply without having to go and write CRUD code. Because I know how much everybody just loves being able to develop CRUD code. It's always a lot of fun. But for now, we're going to get rid of this person, and we're going to take advantage of something called bootstrapping. So I right-click my database node. I'm going to select Import New Entities from Excel, and then I have a spreadsheet called Company Data. And if I go ahead and open this up, what we'll see is just, you can imagine kind of the idea of a small telecom company. They've got, keeping track of their customers, customer notes, and various jobs, right? They may be installing routers or TV boxes or things like that. Each of these tabs represents a set of data that this company is currently using Excel to keep track of. We want to bring those into kind of the more pure application development world. And we can do that by selecting that Excel spreadsheet, open that up, and it's going to tell me, here are the entities that I found based on the sheets in that Excel spreadsheet. Do you want to import those? Yes, I do. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, this is great so far, right? What we've got is we've added structures, which are basically in-memory representations of the data that's in these worksheets, which allows us to work with them, kind of loop over them, etc., just separate from the data. We've got the data entities themselves, right? So things like tasks. Again, we've got all of the attributes that represent the different columns. Notice again, if I've got the customer, notice I've got a phone. It's already figured out that's a phone number. I've got email. I've got primary address, the region. If I look at name, maybe I might figure, well, some people might have longer names than 50 characters, so maybe I just want to bump that up to 150 characters, right? I can do that on the fly, but the kind of derived or the decisions that the platform has made are pretty good so far. Now, it's not only giving me the data model, it's also setting up some timers that will run the first time I publish this application that then call into logic, which we call server actions, that actually bootstrap the data from the spreadsheet. So if I double click this bootstrap task, this is what we call a flow, right? So this is how we write logic in the low-code world in OutSystems. So we have a start point, which would be kind of the entry of a function, if you think about it, in kind of the standard programming world. We have what's called an aggregate. It's just a data access operation. It's going and getting the tasks from this task entity, and it's getting that as a list. And so we're going to have a conditional or an if that says if the result of this aggregate, if the list that comes back is empty, then we need to fill that entity with the data from the spreadsheet. If it's already got data, then we don't want to bootstrap again, so we're just going to end the procedure there. In the convert from Excel, you'll notice that we've uploaded that spreadsheet to our resources, right? And we want to take the content from that, and we're going to loop over that content, and we're going to look for the record here. The task is going to be that sheet that had the tasks in it. We're going to take the name from the spreadsheet, and then we're going to, we're going to take and assign to this task record local variable, which again has the shape of the task. And we're going to then get the data out of that spreadsheet, right, and pop it into that attribute. We're going to do that over and over again, and then we're going to call this create task action. Again, that's just an OutSystems term for functionality. We call this an action. So we're going to call that data action, and we're going to do that until we've exhausted all the records, and then we're going to end. So what that means is now when I go ahead and click publish again, not only is the application going to compile and generate the database scripts and stuff, it's going to update the database with these entity structures. So when I first imported these, they're just represented inside the IDE as application metadata. When I publish is when they actually get created on the database. And then our processes will run, and the data will appear in the various tables. So now if I right-click on the task and I view data, we should see that there is indeed data in our application. Now let's take it to the next level here. Let's say we want to add, actually, I'm going to do this a different way. Let's say that we want to have our application have some tasks, the ability to list and edit tasks. So I'm going back to my flow. You can see now we've got our dashboard. The little house just means that's our home screen. That's where we're going to land when we open the application by default. If I grab the task entity and I drag that, and not rename it, if I drag this out over onto my flow, you can see there's a little star there. That's just indicating that there's an accelerator at play here. You could call it a wizard or an accelerator. This is going to scaffold out two screens based on that entity. It's going to give me a list screen, and it's going to give me a details screen. So now I've got those two screens, and if we go back over to our interface tab, you can see that it's created the task list as well as all of the various local variables it needs for sorting, for searching, etc. It's got the data request to get the list of tasks. It's got some what we call client actions. So what we're going to do when we search, when we sort, when we do pagination, all that's built in. Take a look at the UI. You can see again, kind of we've got a pretty nice looking UI just out of the box. And when we click on a given task, we'll get the details for that task. Okay, so let's go ahead and do another publish.
Yeah, while we're excuse me, while we're waiting for that, there was a question there that you might want to attend to while you're waiting.
Yep, I see that question. And yes, you can write CRUD code against an existing database. So there's actually another tool we call Integration Studio. So you can actually point that to a connection string, bring whatever pieces of that database you want in, either tables as entities, etc., and then leverage those directly inside of your OutSystems applications. So they just become essentially another component. All right, so we'll go quickly over here. Oh, one other thing that I wanted to do, which I forgot to make it anonymous, and I also want to, actually, no, that I did not forget that piece. So notice that tasks also got added to the navigation bar by default. That happens when you're scaffolding, not necessarily going to happen with if you do it by hand, you would need to drag and drop that screen onto the navigation bar to get that to show up. So let's go ahead and refresh our screen here. Now we can see we've got our tasks, right? So we can sort, right? We can say I want only stuff that's got router, and you can see that it's dynamically searching as we type here. I can tell it I want to add a task. Oh, and I forgot to make my task detail anonymous. I'm taking full advantage of the quick publish here, obviously, with some of my forgetfulness. So if we go back here, we should be able to, there we go. So we could add a new task, but I could say install wireless router. I could say installation of Charlie's wireless router. Right, save that, and you can see that save does indeed get represented here. And again, if we decided to show this as kind of iPhone style or iPad style, right, you get a dynamic view of that information based on the type of device that you're using. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes. I'm going to push through and do a few more demo scenarios. I can stick around after one if people have questions. I know I want to respect people's time, so I'm going to focus on getting more of the demo stuff done, and I've got a couple of slides after that, but not a ton. So let's get to the next scenario. So one of the cool things, in addition to kind of the mobile responsiveness, is the ability to very quickly change the look and feel of the application. So there's a theme editor here, and I can do things like, I can say maybe I want what could be. Let's try this one just because it could be fun color combinations here. So I can change the background color. I can change the header color. I can change the primary color, so green and orange, who doesn't love that? And yes, I'm going for as garish as I possibly can just for the fun of it. I can apply shadows to some of my elements, right? So there's things that I can do here pretty rapidly to change the look and feel. I can make rounded buttons and search boxes, right? So with just a few clicks, I've very quickly changed the look and feel of my application. Again, I can publish that. Now, this is not the only way to change the look and feel. This is kind of the fast and easy way. You can also get full access to the CSS for your application. So you can kind of see the underlying OutSystems UI framework has its own set of CSS. The application has its own set of CSS. Those you cannot edit directly, but I can also override CSS and customize it at the application level or at the screen level. So I've got complete control over the styles used in this application. So if I go back over to my demo app and we refresh, right, we'll now see the new look and feel of the application. Lovely, very lovely. And as I said, pagination built in, very, very straightforward. All right. So let's take a look at a REST scenario. So I thought with the recent launch of the SpaceX mission, I think it was last week, I actually got to watch that with my kids. It was really cool to watch that, especially when they were boarding the International Space Station. I thought leveraging a NASA API would be kind of a cool thing to do. So I'm going to kind of show consuming an API. And I'm going to do that by starting with the logic tab and using this integrations folder, and I'm going to consume a REST API. So there's a couple ways to do this. If you're familiar with Swagger or Open API metadata, you can actually take a Swagger file or a Swagger URL and add everything associated with that REST API all at once. You can also just use a single method, which is what I'm going to do here. So over here on the api.nasa.gov, they have APOD, the astronomy picture of the day. I thought that would be a cool one. So I'm just going to copy that URL. And you can see it's got some query parameters, so we're going to need to add those as well. So I'm going to paste in the API there. And then I'm going to do a query string. I'll say, what was it? Date equals pick date, and API underscore, yeah, API underscore key equals API key. And I think I fat fingered that all right. So what this is doing is I want to do a GET request against this URL. The brackets are simply placeholders for the values that need to go in. So now I can switch over to this test tab, and you can see that it's generated the places for me to put in test values already. So for example, if I change this to data, or actually, sorry, if I change this to my pick date, see how that dynamically changes, right? So it's picking that up from those values in the braces. So I happen to know this wants to be in this format, and then you can use demo key for the key. I'm going to test that, and it says, "Hey, something is not right here." Okay, what did I do wrong there? So we'll go back to the should be demo underscore key, right? Did I do that? Yeah. Year, month, date. All right, what did I do wrong? Incorrect field passed. Oh, I did not fix my date there. There we go. Yay, all right. So troubleshooting on the fly. So this is giving me back an explanation of a given picture as well as URLs and such. Now the cool thing is here, I have to admit I'm a bit of a geek in that I love JSON, right? JSON is this representation of data, JavaScript object notation. I really love JSON because it's lightweight and it allows you to do a lot with a little. But I also hate JSON because if you have a brace or a bracket or a comma or a semicolon in the wrong place or a colon in the wrong place, it can totally blow up and ruin your day. So when I click copy to response body, what this is actually going to do for me when I click finish is it will generate a structure that represents the response, and that can include nested objects and properties. This one's relatively simple, but it's got the date, the explanation, the high def URL, the media type, etc. Right? So all of that is taken care of for me. I don't have to parse that JSON manually. So now that we have this get APOD, right, what we need to do is find a place for it to go on the screen. So, or we'll need a screen first. So I'm going to just take and make a blank screen called APOD. And I can say NASA pick of the day. And then I'm just going to grab an image control and drop it on the screen. Now the image control wants to know where it's going to get the image. Defaults to local image. I can tell it go to an external URL, and conveniently Now I can say I want to fetch data from other sources at a pod. And I can go back over here and say, give me the picture of the day. Now, it's going to want this API key. I'm actually just going to swipe that from a pre-built version here for the sake of time. Always have a pre-baked version of your demo, I say. And we're just going to leave the pick date blank for now, just again, in the interest of time. And this is showing me a warning. Now, one of the things that you can see here is we actually get some nice warnings or errors when we have things that are wrong here. So I can say, I want this to be a pod, and I'm going to set the data type to use that structure that we saw earlier. So you see I've got this get a pod response, right? Now, in order for this to work, I need to set that output. So I'm going to say my apod here, value getting out is going to be the response from my call to that REST API. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things here, right? I'm calling a NASA API, but you could very easily use this same functionality to interoperate with a ColdFusion REST API. So for those of you who may not be aware, ColdFusion actually has been able to do APIs for, I think Charlie said, since 2011. So for almost a decade, it's been able to take care of the REST API. So you could totally use that as an integration scenario here. Now that I've got my my apod returning, I just need to point it to the URL here. Okay, and now that other error goes away, and we can go ahead and do a publish. And thank you, Bella, for helping me find the query string. You were absolutely correct. That was the error I was running into. And Charlie posted some helpful links in case you haven't seen those. And now we should be able to go back up. And I did forget one thing. As I mentioned before, I can just take my screen, drag it onto the navigation bar, and we'll quickly republish that so that I can get to it from the navigation bar.
And while we're waiting for that, let me jump in and say for anybody that maybe has to get going now here at the top of the hour, Andrew will be sharing some links as well, and those will all be captured in the recording so you can watch this afterwards and catch up on everything.
Yep.
If you gotta go.
Absolutely. Oh, one other thing I forgot. Got to get in the habit of the anonymous. By the way, anonymous is great for a demo. If you're doing actual data, don't ever turn anonymous on. Bad idea. So good practice for demo, bad practice for actual application. All right, there we go. So now we can see we've got the NASA pick of the day. It defaults without the date parameter. It defaults to today's. So today's is kind of a beautiful spiral nebula. That's pretty cool. So that's the simple version. I actually did build a more complex version, but I'm going to pause there on the demos just for the sake of people's time. I got a couple more slides I want to just do quickly here, and let me just quickly fix that. And we'll swap our screens. Thank you, PowerPoint, for defaulting to the wrong one. And we should be back to PowerPoint. We are. So just a couple quick things to wrap things up. One thing that came up or that comes up sometimes is the question of, do you have to choose, right? I mentioned in the description of the talk that I'm not telling you to abandon ColdFusion, right? We can have multiple tools in our tool belt. So the answer to, do I have to choose? No. Seriously, no. You can use both, right? As I mentioned, one scenario for interoperation is you've got some REST services that you built in ColdFusion. You want to build a quick prototype UI on top of them. Low code might be a great way of doing that. It's really important to choose the tool that works best for your particular application or use case, right? That's the ideal. Some resources. I will pop these into the chat here if I can grab them quickly. So in case you want to go ahead and click on these, that's not going to work that way, sorry. Multi-line does not work apparently, so give me just a moment here. So learn, outsystems.com/learn is where you can find training, including some what we call guided path training. So it kind of walks you through step by step. Forge is our open source library. For those who can stick around, if Charlie's willing to humor me, I can show you a quick demo around that. And then last but not least is the Advocacy Hints and Tips YouTube playlist. So this is a playlist of as it might make sense, hints and tips videos, including there's actually a video that shows off the candy dispenser that I showed the picture of, so you can kind of see that in operation. Last but not least, I encourage you to try it out. Give it a try, kick the tires. I did get a question from someone who prior to the talk, who asked about, well, what do we do if we want to try low code, but our organization's not ready to try it? Completely understandable. There's two kind of ways that you can go about working with that. One is you can do it as a hobby. As I said, you can kind of try to find something fun to do. Might be do an application for your local club or your church, or once we're able to play sports again, or your sports team. That's one way to go about it. The other thing is, if you're in an organization that has a really big backlog, just go to your boss or go to your team and say, hey, I'd like to try this particular kind of small thing that's on our backlog. Let me try using this just to try it out. So that's another scenario you could try. Speaking of trying, we're going to provide a $50 US Amazon gift card to one person who goes to try.outsystems.com, enters the event code CF, and gives it a try. So again, no cost to you. The trial version is absolutely free forever. You don't need a credit card. You don't need anything special. It'll create what we call a personal edition of the platform. You'll get the same development tool that I just showed off, and go have fun. So that's what I've got in terms of the slides. As I mentioned, I do have one other use case that would be kind of fun to go over if people have time and want to stick around for one more demo. But I'm also happy to wrap it up or just do a Q&A. Really all a matter of what you all would like to do.
Well, let me switch the screen display to give folks a chance to share their ratings of things. So go ahead, and folks that are left here, go ahead and fill those out on the right side of the screen. And then if you do have any questions, you can see that the chat pod's a bit bigger. It's easier to see. So if you want to ask any questions or share any thoughts before you go, feel free. And then sure, we can switch back the screen share and even leave the recording on if you'd like, and capture that before we get going. And while we wait for the feedback, I'll say thank you for giving the talk and for sharing what's shared.
Oh, my pleasure.
Good stuff. So it doesn't look like there's any comments or questions. And we've got about half the people. Now it's about 2/3 of the people have filled out the eval. So I'll tell you what, in the interest of letting you go ahead and do that, I'll switch it back to the sharing mode, and you can go back to sharing your
Absolutely.
Screen.
All right, so we left off on the NASA pick of the day. I mentioned that we have a YouTube playlist. That's what it's called, a YouTube playlist, where we do some demo videos. And I actually ended up the scenario I want to kind of talk about a little bit is reuse, right? So I mentioned that you can do HTML, JavaScript, etc. Had a question come up on the forums, I think it was last week or the week before, where somebody wanted to do embedding YouTube videos inside of our newer responsive web applications. For our traditional web, which was kind of the previous architecture for mobile, there have been components in our Forge open source library for those scenarios, for those application types for a while, but there wasn't one for kind of the reactive type of application. So I thought, well, it'd be easy enough to answer the question in the forum by just saying, well, here's the API that you use, here's how you would write the code to do that. But that's kind of a high code way of doing things. So rather than do that, I built a control or a widget that would essentially embed a YouTube player. So the way that I get at that, if I were to go over here to the OutSystems tab, this allows me to browse the Forge open source library. And so if I typed in YouTube, you can see that there is this YouTube reactive component, which is by our advocacy team. That would be me being one of them. And so I published this in order to make it simple to use this iframe player API without having to worry about knowing about how to embed an iframe, without having to worry about any of the JavaScript libraries. Just give it the basic information and embed a video. So if I go back over here, I've already got this installed in my local environment. So if I go down to the bottom here, you can see I have this YouTube reactive component, right? So if I go back to our ColdFusion application, I can add a new screen. We'll just call this YouTube player. And I can just add that as a title. And then I'm just going to come into my dependencies. So there's just a little button on here, and I can search for the producer module for YouTube Reactive. And then I select the player, and it takes several arguments, right? It says I can do a video ID, the height, the width, and it also exposes an event when that video completes. So I can actually take some action in my code when the video finishes playing. And once I apply that, you can see that shows up here in my UI flows under widgets, and there's my widget. So I can just simply drag this onto the screen, right? And one of the things that I did to try to make this super, super simple is you don't actually have to provide any of this information. It will default to one of the videos from our how-to list if you don't supply a video ID. But if you wanted to, you could programmatically supply a video ID, or you can do just a hard-coded string here, right? And I could change the height and width. So I could say I want this to be, let's say 720 by or forget what the ratio is there. Whatever. So we'll do it that way. Okay. So we'll go ahead and, once again, I forgot the anonymous. I'll get that habit sooner or later. So I'll republish with my anonymous. And then we'll open it up in the browser. We'll go to the YouTube player. And what we'll see here is it's now going to play the candy dispenser video. Right? And you probably hear that, my dulcet tones. So I'm not going to play through the whole video, but you can see that very, very quickly I was able to take and embed a YouTube video. And what this is actually doing is it's actually adding a JavaScript library supplied by Google. It's calling the library at the appropriate time to load that JavaScript dynamically, and then loading the video dynamically. So all of those things are happening via iframe and JavaScript APIs. But from the perspective of the developer, it's literally just a drag and drop and set a few properties, right? So again, I could set any of these properties programmatically if I wanted to, but I can also just set them statically depending on what my use case is. And because this application is an Forge component, which is open source, once I've got this in my environment, I can also actually open that application directly in the IDE and examine how that application is built. So, let's see, should actually open that up. Maybe I'll just need to shortcut it here. But you can see, for example, that I have a set of JavaScript, right? That is what is ultimately loading that video for me. This script is then marked on the widget as being a required script, right? And then when my widget is ready, I'm actually going to call a client action that's going to initialize the JavaScript, right? And so it's basically pulling the parameters for height and width and video ID. All of those things are going to come from these properties of the widget. So it's going to load that up. But for example, if no video ID is provided, it's going to default to this one, right? If no width or height are provided, it's going to default to those values, right? Those are things that for the, for someone who knows a lot of JavaScript or, works with JavaScript regularly, not too intimidating, but why have to deal with them over and over again if all you really care about is embedding a YouTube video, right? It's that abstraction that makes for higher productivity. So hopefully that was worth the extra time for the demo. That will wrap it up for real. And again, happy to stick around and answer any questions.
And there was one.
And I see that there's a chat, but I actually, for some reason, Connect is not showing me that.
Oh, no problem. I can tell you it's.
Do you have the ability to stop sharing? Because I don't seem to have the button right now.
Sure.
Wow. Okay. All of my stuff in Connect has gotten really scrunched.
There's just one question. It's easy for me to just relate to you. And by the way, while I do that,
so what was
the rest of you, if you haven't filled out the forms on the right, please go ahead and do that. But yeah, the question was how many jobs are looking for low-code developers right now?
So I don't have a specific number from the standpoint of all up. I know that we tend to track specifically for OutSystems. We track how many developers our customers are looking for, and I know like for US, I'm pretty sure, I think it's for US, the last number I saw was well over 1,000. Globally, I think it's significantly more than that. But again, those are specifically just tracking OutSystems jobs. In terms of low code, there's a lot of vendors, in the market. We're not obviously the only game in town. So it's certainly, it is robust and growing. I think is the best way I can put that.
And of course, learning it and using it to get a job isn't the primary motivation right now. It would be to use it either just to explore it or to use it in your work environment to identify.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think, if somebody is not employed and they're looking for work, learning anything is a good move, right? I've kind of been in that world, right? When I mentioned that I started off in the theater world and moved into IT from there. The best advice I was ever given was from a family member who had his own software development, shop, and he said, get certified, right? He said, find something that that you want to learn it, get certified, and that certification will show people that you know enough to be valuable, right, and get your foot in the door. So I think that advice still applies. What if you're looking for work, you need both skills and ways to show someone that you have those skills, right? And certification can be a good way of doing that.
And even showing desire to learn.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like, it's funny that you say that, Charlie, because one of the first software development job I ever got was actually because I had applied. I had met someone at a local conference And I talked to him about how to move from, I was previously on kind of the IT track, learning about networking and such, how to move from that into being a software developer. And he said, well, you probably want to go to work for like a Microsoft solution provider, because this was a Microsoft conference. And he said, well, why don't you send me a resume? So I sent him a resume, and then within 3 weeks, I had taken and passed a certification for programming in Visual Basic. And what they saw in my resume and in that certification was a progression, right? They saw that I was aggressively learning and getting certifications, and that I was pushing myself to learn. And that got me the interview, right? It didn't necessarily get me the job, but at least got me in the door to talk to people. And then they hired me. And I was really blessed to be put with a bunch of really good programmers, where I could be a total sponge and learn a lot, so a lot of it is, sometimes it's right place, right time. But indeed, what you say, Charlie, is true, that showing people that you are eager to learn is a great way of, getting your foot in the door.
And Nathan had a follow-on question, and then Jen sharing some helpful follow-on information.
Okay. So what was the follow-on question?
Oh, sorry, I thought you could see it right now. Yeah,
I don't,
no problem.
unfortunately, it's not showing
So
for me.
he said, are there a lot of OutSystem remote jobs, or do they tend to be on-site? Yeah, probably hard for you to say for sure, but
Yeah, I mean, I think that really varies. You know, I think that when there are people who are really in need of programmers, they're a lot more flexible about the arrangements.
and
But
perhaps
yeah,
now more than
it's probably going to vary based on country and company and
sure. And past experience, even 4 months ago, wouldn't really be relevant because things have changed so much in the past 3 or 4 months. So
yeah,
the answer
true
should
enough.
probably
Probably a
yes.
lot more remote
Exactly.
opportunities than there were.
Exactly. For whatever you want to do. And it looks like there's one last person typing, although I've seen his name typing and then I never see it show up, so he might be sending private messages. Okay, there you go. All right, cool. Thank you for that, Dinesh. All right, well, let's go ahead and stop the recording. And in case anybody's maybe waiting to ask a question without it being recorded, that can happen. So I'll say again, thank you, Andrew, for this, and hope people find
Thank you
value
for
in
the
pursuing
opportunity.
it. And good to hear your perspectives on things. Thanks for sharing us about the tool, and hope folks will go check it out. And then follow up with Andrew for more. And we'll see you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody who wants to try to connect with me on LinkedIn or, I'm also on Twitter as DevHammer. Lots of ways to reach me. So
Good deal. Thanks for sharing that too. All right, sir. Thanks,
thank you.
and talk to you all next time. Stopping the recording.